Welcome to the Project Management Prepcast, the direct route to PMP exam success. Here's your instructor, Cornelius Fichtner.
Hello and welcome to the Project Management Prepcast, where preparing for the PMP exam simply means pressing play. I'm your instructor, Cornelius Fichtner. The PMP exam is primarily an experience-based exam. Oh yes, you will find some questions on the exam that will test your general project management knowledge. Most of them, however, they will be situational. On these situational questions, you'll have to apply your experience to the question while remaining within the PMBOK guide framework. In this lesson, we look at requirements elicitation, which requires building relationships and trust among project stakeholders. When trust is absent, the requirements elicitation process will take longer, be incomplete, and lead to lower morale. Although building relationships takes time and effort, it can actually shorten project time and result in improved project performance. This discussion will present to you how to build trust and thereby help you during the creation of your scope. At this time, I normally introduce our guests, but right now let's head straight into the interview because Richard and Elizabeth Larson will introduce themselves at the start. It has been about 5 weeks since my interview with Elizabeth Larson and Richard Larson from Watermark Learning. And at that time, we talked on the topic of projects without borders, the difficulties that we project managers face with intercultural projects. Well, Richard and Elizabeth are back, and welcome again to the program. Hello, Richard.
Glad to be back.
And hello, Elizabeth.
Hi, glad to be back as well.
Well, today we'll be talking about topic gathering requirements and go away, please. But before we get into that, Richard, why don't you take a moment and remind our listeners of your illustrious career?
Well, about 30 years ago, I started working in the field at a large bank as an EDP liaison, which today is an outdated sounding title, but it really was all of the functions of a business analyst. And there really wasn't that kind of career in the past, so I went the technical route and worked in application development for a number of years, doing many different kinds of projects. I always seemed to get tapped to be taking responsibility for project planning, although I was never formally trained, and I made every mistake in the book as I learned about it. And so after a number of years of painful experiences, I wanted to share what I had learned with other people. And so all those hard lessons learned and pain really prompted me to go into the training field. And about 15 years ago, I started Watermark Learning as a result. And now I feel really fortunate I can combine many years as a BA, a project manager, and overall general business management every day, and I love it.
And Elizabeth, your career is not any less illustrious. Please remind us as well of what you did.
I started my career doing management consulting, presenting recommendations to management. That led into being a business analyst. I was a business analyst for almost a decade. I was promoted into project management. I was a project manager for almost 15 years at 3 different organizations, working on large IT projects, introducing new technology and the associated business processes to organizations. I joined Watermark in 1996 and have been training, presenting, writing articles. It's been just wonderful.
Great, thank you. Well, I'm so pleased to have you back, really, really. The interview that we're doing today is based on an article that both of you have written. It is titled Gathering Requirements, Go Away Please. And I think the general feel from the article that I got is that it is very important to engage stakeholders in the requirements gathering process. What is the single most important factor then for engaging stakeholders?
There are really several really important ones, and I think that if I had to choose the most important way to engage stakeholders is to build a relationship and start building trust with them. There are a lot of things that go into that, but I think if we're really going to engage our stakeholders, if we're going to elicit and document the requirements, there really has to be an element of trust because we will be changing their lives. I think there are some other things that are really important, clearly defining roles and responsibilities, being the focal point for communicating, for reporting project progress, are some other things that are important as well to make sure that our sponsors don't forget about us and that they are engaged.
Well, I think trust is probably the single most important factor because without it, you're going to either get incomplete requirements, you are going to get people that may want to sabotage a project because they don't want to give up the expertise and the power they might have with the current system, and so there's nothing in it for them to want to give up on all of those things. And so, trust is no guarantee, but without it, it becomes very, very difficult.
Elizabeth, how do you build trust then with your stakeholders?
There are several different aspects, I think, to building trust. First of all, I think it's very, very important to communicate bad news. That gives you some credibility. So we can't just say the project's going well. When there's an issue, I think it is important to take that to the people that need to know it. I think it's important, very important, to be genuine, to be authentic, and of course honest. I think that we need to build our credibility, and part of that is being competent. I think part of it is admitting our mistakes. I think part of it is making recommendations. I think we need to figure out what the business problem is and help people try and solve it. And I really do think that builds trust. Because if we can alleviate some pain, people are apt to put their trust into us. Developing relationships, being genuinely interested, silly things like bringing treats, laughing together, valuing other people's input, collaborating are just a few. Rich, what else would you add?
I think you covered a lot of these central things. I think you can maybe sum up some of what you said by respect, both for yourself and others, because that sets the stage for that. And so some of the things, acknowledging your mistakes, acknowledging contributions of others, giving credit where credit is due. There are a lot of different things that become skilled. Many times we end up intuitively doing things to build trust because we all have relationships that are trustworthy. It's just where there is difficulty for a variety of reasons why you can actually build skills to go and work on trust factors with other people to help enhance that trust where it's not coming naturally.
Okay, so I'm working on the trust building and I'm bringing treats and I'm laughing with people. And at what point, Elizabeth, at what point do I know, okay, my people trust me now, I can go gather requirements?
There are a couple of aspects to that. First of all, we build trust throughout the project. We can't just say, I'm going to spend the next 2 weeks building trust, and then we gather requirements. We build trust as we're gathering requirements. Now, needless to say, if I have built credibility as a project manager, as a business analyst on prior projects, I come into the project with more trust than not. I think that part of it is being prepared, being organized so that when you're meeting with a sponsor and the business clients, they trust that you do have that element of competency. And that's much more important than saying, look, I've worked on lots of projects in the past and I've been successful. So we build trust throughout the project. And as I said, part of that is acknowledging mistakes and communicating bad news. So that trust isn't something we just do in the beginning of the project and hope that people believe us. I'm not sure I answered your question.
Well, I really think there's no point where you say, aha, I've got trust, but there are points when you can see where people are not trusting you. And maybe that's perhaps in the end more important, where you sit in a meeting, and I was just talking with a student last week. She said stakeholders at a process requirements meeting, they would sit in the room, you can't see me on this podcast, but their arms folded tightly against their chest with a scowl on their face. And you can learn to recognize those signs that, there's some trust issues here that we haven't overcome them. So maybe the absence of that indicates, well, you made some progress. But I think it's probably more in human nature to notice when the trust is not there. And there's no magic point where it suddenly starts happening, but it's a slower process sometimes.
While we're talking about your students, Richard, us project managers, we're always looking for the silver bullet, right? Do you at Watermark in your training sessions have some sort of almost like a checklist if you want to build trust, do the following 5 things.
We do. I mean, we bring it up in many classes, don't we, Elizabeth? That
we do in all classes, and we
really,
talk about
yeah.
We do have a checklist. Some things I mentioned to you came from our checklist, but that doesn't guarantee that that trust will be built. But it is something for people to think about.
And some of those are in the article that we've written that I think your listeners will be able to refer to after in the notes, correct?
Yes, absolutely. I will definitely put a link to this article into the show notes. So we're talking about resistance. How do you deal with the resistance that you feel from your clients, from your stakeholders, Elizabeth?
It depends on what the resistance is and who it's coming from. First of all, right from the get-go, if I don't have an engaged sponsor, that's a huge risk for me. So assuming I don't feel that I can manage a project or gather requirements if I don't have the will of the people with whom I'm dealing, including the sponsor. If I have a really engaged sponsor and I'm really solving a major business problem, I have in the past gone to the sponsor and I've talked about a requirements workshop that I've had where someone wasn't engaged, and I could tell that there was definite strategies for getting that person engaged, coming better from the sponsor than from me. There are times, again, where people can be very, very threatened by what we're doing. Another major way that I handle this, besides talking to the sponsor, which to me, again, that partnership, that relationship with the sponsor is very, very important. But another way that I handle the resistance is by making sure that people's personal goals are aligned with the organizational goals and making sure that my project goals are aligned with the organization's goals. And having that kind of discussion, because if there is misalignment among any of those, then that needs to be a further discussion.
How do you find out about the personal goals of your team members then?
Have that discussion. And as a project manager, that's a discussion that I always have in the beginning of a project because I want to make sure that alignment is there. And there might be some times when personal goals, where there is a misalignment, then it's important to talk about a career in the organization and does it make sense for that person. That hasn't happened very often, but it has happened. So just want to make sure, again, particularly if I have resistance among team members. And to me, that's slightly easier than if I have resistance among my business clients or who feel threatened by the end results of the project. And I have definitely had that. And sometimes I haven't found out about it. I would meet with someone. I remember this one person on my sales promotion project, and we would meet with him, and he'd say, every time we'd meet, well, I don't remember telling you that. Or, did I tell you that last week? Well, that's just plain wrong. And so week after week after week, we just weren't getting the requirements. And then we finally figured it out. And that's when we had a talk with the sponsor.
Right. That's actually quite a good segue over to the actual requirements gathering process, because we've talked about building trust. We've talked about working on the resistance. Now let's move over into the actual requirements gathering. What is your approach then in regards to gathering requirements from your business clients, from your stakeholders, Elizabeth?
We gather requirements, we call the way we gather it progressive elaboration. So we start with the very, very highest level requirements that we get from our project sponsor, and we document that in the project charter. We then move to flesh that out. I kind of think about putting meat on the bones, if you will. We flesh it out. And we look at our project deliverables, and we think about what are the features and functions of each project deliverable, and that gives us our high-level requirements. And then we need to progressively elaborate that into the detailed requirements. Always, always, always keeping in mind what business problem are we solving, what is the strategic direction of the organization, what are the business objectives, then what are the project objectives, and in what ways does do the requirements link up to the project objectives, the business objectives, the strategic direction, and the business problem that we're solving. So that's at a very, very high level, keeping the business context in mind, because if our requirements don't have that upward linkage, we are going to get scope creep.
Richard, do you have a preferred documentation method for requirements?
Well, we do. We have what we call a concurrent business modeling framework that has some core features to it. There are 5 main elements of it. At the center of it is a requirements list with a traceability matrix to manage things. And then we emphasize process models to capture the business process, use case models where that process involves an interaction with a system, data that supports the use cases in the business processes, and then interface requirements that really touch most everything. And so that kind of requirements package with those elements plus subsidiary documentation as needed tend to be what forms the basis for really sufficient requirements and without overkill. And so it's been a very practical and effective framework that people can apply really in any methodology. And we found some success with it going across from company to company with that approach.
I find that gathering requirements is always an engaged process. Whether you do it by modeling with UML or whether you use your framework that you have just explained. And I'm either faced with stakeholders that are disengaged, who don't really want to because they think they've given me everything they need, or as time progresses, there's just, this project is so old, we're working on 3 new projects, the grass is greener on the other side. Elizabeth, how can I keep my stakeholders engaged?
2 answers to that. First is take large projects and break them into small pieces, so that we are constantly producing something of value to the business. And I don't mean just necessarily using an iterative approach to either managing projects or gathering requirements. But if we have large projects, break it down into pieces. We did that with sales promotions so that we produced a transaction piece and a reporting piece and a forecasting piece. And so that kept people engaged. The other thing, of course, is I keep going back to this, but if my sponsor isn't engaged, then everyone else, all my business experts are going to lose interest as well. From my perspective, if it's not important to the business, I don't want to be working on the project. If it is important, then I need my sponsor to explain to the world why it's an important project. So I keep going back to that relationship with the sponsor, which is so key. And keep it short.
Yeah, once again, we're back to the trust, right? We're
back to the trust and keep it short. Show people and actually implement deliverables and in my case that happened to be software that that was fully functional, but short pieces of it.
To add on to that, another thread that we see a lot of applications for has to do with what you might call even marketing or selling a change. We have other articles that deal with that, and essentially everybody listens to the radio station WIIFM, what's in it for me? And if you ignore that, you do that at your peril with keeping people engaged, because if there are benefits you can look at, especially when we center in on, as Elizabeth said earlier, solving business problems, taking away the pain, people really get engaged with that. And they know we're tuned into their radio station, and that helps immensely. And so there are a number of things from the sales field that you can apply to project management and business analysis that I think really has a lot to teach us as practitioners if we were to apply those and use them in sort of those hidden aspects of, as Elizabeth said earlier, we're always about change. We're bringing change to people's lives, and that's many times threatening. And so that has helped, I think, in keeping people engaged.
Let me make sure I understand correctly what you've said. You've said find out what makes your stakeholders tick, what they will get out of this project, where they have a pain, and make sure that they understand that this project will make that pain go away.
Right. That's a nice summary. Mm-hmm.
Great summary.
Good.
Much shorter than I said it.
Well, thank you. We've talked about building trust with the stakeholders on the project. Is it also important to go outside of your project and actually build trust within the company with people who may not necessarily be involved in the project that you're working on?
I do think that is really important. We have talked about the sponsor, but it is important to understand, if you will, the political landscape of the organization. to form relationships with people outside the project. You might be on one project this week or this year. Next week, you might be on a different project. Also, I just think that having people outside your immediate project helps you with some support that you might need. It helps if you need some information, if you need some understanding. So absolutely, I do think it is important.
Richard, do you have any other ideas on where you need to build trust as a project manager?
Well, again, I want to go back to it, and I don't want to sound like we're secret agents, but there are always project saboteurs, and people that you want to pay attention to, in addition to your champions, are people with high influence but low acceptance of what your project is doing. And looking at that almost as a guideline to find those kinds of stakeholders that might end up hurting the effort would be time well spent, I think.
Well, thank you. I appreciate your time today. And thank you again for having been on the program.
Well, thank you for your time and having us.
You're welcome, and thank you for putting up with the problems with Skype too, Cornelia. It's nice talking to you.